Howdy. Howdy. We need to try that again. Howdy. Howdy. There we go. Ambassador Zoellick even had a good howdy there. Thank you, sir. I'm Max Angerholzer. I'm honored to be the CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. And on behalf of our friends at the Mosbacher Institute and the Bush School, welcome you all to the 2022 ConocoPhillips White House Lecture. So great to have so many of you here in the Annenberg Presidential Conference Center and also online. I think we learned during the pandemic that we can do virtual events really well. And so having a hybrid event like this, I think is going to be the new standard moving forward. So I want to thank all of you all for being here in College Station with us and all of you who are participating online. I really appreciate it. I'm going to do a few quick thank yous. I promise I won't stand in the way of the program for too long. First and foremost, want to thank Ambassador Zoellick. He's the star of the show tonight, but it's always a big deal to have him here in College Station. He is a preeminent public servant, and it's an honor that he's going to spend some time with us this evening. We also appreciate the fact he serves on the board of the foundation. So thank you, Bob, for all you do. And of course, ConocoPhillips. So this is the 25th anniversary of the Bush School and of the Bush Library. And I can think of very few partners that we've had in the last 25 years that have been more consequential than ConocoPhillips in supporting the work of the Bush Center. They've really been incredible. Their current chairman and CEO, Ryan Lance, is a member of the foundation's board. He's been an extraordinary supporter of all things Bush School, all things Bush Center. He couldn't be with us tonight, but his colleague Andrew Lundquist is with us. And I said to Andrew a minute ago that we need to get him an office here because he's been a very loyal participant in a lot of our activities recently. He's also on the advisory board of the Bush School. So Andrew, thank you for all you do. Also wanted to say what an honor it is to be part of this Bush Center every day. I mean, we've got an amazing team here at the foundation, and being able to work with our friends at the Bush School and the Bush Library really is special. Warren Finch is the director of the library. He and his team do an amazing job, so really appreciate Warren being here tonight and his deputy, Bob Holzwey. And then also the Bush School, the dean is General Mark Welsh, and his deputy is Frank Ashley, so really appreciate Frank being here tonight as well. It would be remiss if I didn't mention the amazing partnership we have with Texas A&M University. It really is extraordinary. They are huge fans and supporters of everything that happens here at the Bush Center. Chancellor Sharp and President Banks are incredible to work with, and we really appreciate all they do to support the work here. Andy Acker is here on behalf of Chancellor Sharp and Dr. Banks tonight, and again, really appreciate that partnership with Texas A&M. A couple more quick important people to acknowledge. Phil Adams is here with us tonight. He's a longtime supporter of the Bush School and formerly served on the Board of Regents of Texas A&M. And also General Randy House, who I've only been here for about 18 months, but I think every Bush School event he's at, I'd like to think that I have as good an attendance record as Randy does, but General House is a fixture here and serves on the advisory board of the Bush School. So Randy, thanks for all that you do. We have many important people who are joining us virtually tonight. One shout out because I'm a really big fan of hers, but Ambassador Carla Hills I know is participating virtually, and she was a U.S. trade representative under President George H.W. Bush, and among many other accolades, Bob Zoellick got to be a successor of hers in President George W. Bush's administration. We have Ambassador Carolina Barco. So she is the former foreign minister of Colombia and also the Colombian ambassador to the United States. So it's always great to have Carolina here. So before we move forward, last but not least, I want to acknowledge Rob Mosbacher, who's here with us tonight. He's probably most famous for being married to Carolina, but in addition to that, he and his father and their family set the standard for what it means to be in public service and to be successful in the business world and to give back. So the Mosbachers obviously are very close with the Bush family, and they've been fixtures here in Texas A&M since the Bush Center started. So really thankful to have Rob here. He's had a very successful public service career in his own right. He ran the Overseas Private Investment Corporation for President George W. Bush, and he's a great supporter of everything that we do here at the Bush School and the Mosbacher Institute, and he's also on the board of the foundation. So without further ado, Rob, please join me up here.
Max, thank you very much for a very kind and generous introduction, and for the great job you're doing as head of the foundation. Getting briefed on the progress that continues to be made and the relationship that you've built around this university is proof that the board made the right decision in picking you to run this great institution. This is a great treat for me. I'm a big fan of Bob Zoellick's. I have been for a long time. For one brief period, I had a chance to work as part of a team with him in the George W. Bush administration. And, when you talk about public service, and that's what this school is all about, is training people to be public servants, you couldn't have really a better example in so many ways than Bob Zoellick in the tradition of George Herbert Walker Bush and the family. And so it's particularly a treat for him to be here, not only because of his public service, but also because here we are at the Mosbacher Institute, which I've told audiences before, Bush 41, in the last 3 months of my dad's life, decided to create this institute because of my dad's involvement in NAFTA and in his very strong belief in trade, expanded trade, free trade, two-way street, he would always say. But Bob's great service as our U.S. trade representative makes him one of the perfect folks to come talk to us a little bit about what he's learned and what we could do perhaps better or differently. So he's had a mix of positions. I want to just kind of run through some of the positions that he had, and leadership positions. From 2007 to 2012, he was head of the World Bank. From 2005 to 2006, he was Deputy Secretary of State. That's the number 2 job at the State Department. 2001 to 2005, he was U.S. Trade Representative, as I mentioned. And then during the Reagan and Bush administration, he was Counsel to the Secretary of Treasury, who happened to be James A. Baker. He was Undersecretary of State, and he was White House Deputy Chief of Staff. And I would say, when you look at all the things that Bob's accomplished, I suspect he might agree that in many ways, some of the most lasting impacts he had was serving in the Bush administration, Bush 41, as sort of a deputy for James A. Baker. And he played an integral role in pretty important things like the unification of Germany. And so, again, an opportunity for him to serve our country, but with a lower profile. Since his service at the World Bank, he's been senior counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical, which is an advisory service, part of the Brunswick Group, and a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University at the Kennedy School. He has also written an absolutely wonderful book, if you're interested in diplomacy. It's called America and the World, a History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. He starts with Ben Franklin, goes right up all the way through Bush 41, and I think we'll end up probably hearing a little bit about that tonight. Last but not least, he is not just a believer in trade, but he's a believer in strengthening the relationship we have with our neighbors, our geographic neighbors, Canada, Mexico, but Latin America. And I hope he will talk some about that because he's been a leader on that and, frankly, a voice that's not heard nearly enough. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm, again, a great admirer of what you've done, Bob, and what you continue to do and what you represent in the best of public service. He's going to be interviewed by Dr. Raymond Robertson, and Raymond is no stranger to many of you, but Raymond occupies the Helen and Roy Rue Chair in Economics and Government here and is director of the Mosbacher Institute. And I've said before, and I'll say again, if my dad was around, he would be extremely proud of the leadership you've provided, the enthusiasm you bring to trade, to creativity, to new ideas, and the contribution you're making not only to the students here, but also to the university and to the country through your work and your writing. So Please help me welcome Dr. Raymond Robertson and Ambassador Robert Zoellick.
So I have to thank Rob for that overly generous introduction. I don't know, Rob, if you do memorial events, but if so, I'd like to book you. Don't have a date and time yet, but if you're a little flexible on that. And I do want to say it was a real pleasure when President Bush 43 appointed Rob to be head of OPIC. OPIC's not a very well-known agency, and it's now been put in part of a broader one for American investment and development, but it's very important. And I saw in the Bush 41 administration what it could do if it had innovative, creative leadership. It had a lot of interesting authorities that could use in different ways. And so my job as trade representative was to try to open markets, create opportunities for American business people and workers and farmers, and I guess given where we are, I should add ranchers. But it was really critical to have Rob as a partner to kind of help expedite that through OPIC. So I wanted to thank him for his leadership. But also, as I visited the library today, you had a sense that President Bush 43 and the people around him, including Bob Mosbacher and my boss, James Baker, did really represent people that had a certain gentlemanly style while also, frankly, being fiercely competitive. And Rob has done the same, and I think that's a real compliment. I'm also delighted that Carolina will be with us. Columbia's had such a fantastic story of what it's accomplished coming out of some very sort of dangerous periods, and Carolina has been part of that herself. And Raymond, I know we'll have a chance to talk, but I'm delighted they could lure you from Minnesota and down here a little further south to sort of talk about some of the trade issues. And also, thank you, Max, very much for hosting this and with the support of ConocoPhillips, which I know is important to make any of these institutions successful and lasting over time. I did want to mention one other person from the Texas Aggie community, Michael Young, who until recently was your president, and Mike actually worked with me on German unification as a lawyer, and our careers sort of intersected at various points in time. So you may not know this, he may not know this, but the search firm, when it came time to hire your president, asked me to kind of give a recommendation, and I decided I could lean in that direction for President Young. So it's been wonderful to have a chance to see him again. But most of all, I want to mention my appreciation for all of you joining us and for your interest in the Bush School, the Bush Foundation, the Bush Library, the university as a whole, and the Mosbacher Institute. Any of these institutions in America, and it really does distinguish our country, depend on private support and people that are interested in contributing in any way that they can. And just coming down here even for a few days to sort of see and meet the students, you can see what a tremendous influence it has, for Texas, for our country, and with the international students globally. And that's all because people like you make a difference, so thank you for that. I didn't have a purple suit, so best I could do was kind of this sort of off pink. So I've tried to sort of represent the Aggie community in my own way. Privileged to be with you. Now, our topic this evening is U.S. economic diplomacy. And of course, this subject is riding the waves of news these days. And I suppose for most, the idea of economic diplomacy now triggers thinking about economic sanctions, especially those of finance or technology or exports or investment, or even increasingly, as you're seeing, company self-sanction, deciding that they, for reasons of customers or employees, they don't want to be doing business in Russia. So all sparked by Russia's assault on Ukraine. And of course, the energy industry, which Texas knows well, is in the vortex and has been of this economic storm of use of sanctions for a long time. Now, economic sticks and restrictions are sharp and important tools of economic statecraft. But this evening, I wanted to open with some stories about the positive experience of economic diplomacy. Because what I hope to give you a few tales that will illustrate how America can build its influence and power through the power of economic attraction of our country, carrots as well as sticks. Importantly, connecting the dynamism and innovation of the U.S. private sector to the world. So one of our strengths is not just to do things by the government, but whether it's OPIC or trade and others, to open up what's happening in the United States as a driving force around the globe, building coalitions, assisting allies and partners. And I think while doing all of this, it strengthens our own country because it's more competitive, it's more open, it creates incentives, and it's continually adapting. So I wanted to begin with 3 stories from the past, but then I'll return to the issue of sanctions policy, trying to combine positive and negative tools of economic statecraft in my closing comments. So I want to step back a few years, say 241. So in 1781, Alexander Hamilton had just resigned his post as the principal aide to General George Washington. And many of you will recall Hamilton from the musical, if not from history books. And you know he was an extremely restless intellect, an incredible individual. He retreated to his father-in-law's library to ponder this long war with Great Britain, which at this point had been going on since 1776, and it was a long and difficult struggle. And at heart, one of the ideas that Hamilton recognized is that the Revolutionary War was a war of attrition. And London had had the staying power to maintain fleets, hire mercenaries, the Hessians, continue campaigns despite losses and setbacks, supply its armies across this incredibly long transatlantic passage because the British financial system enabled huge borrowings. So you can see this in letters that Hamilton wrote when he went through this period of thinking, that he said, London's credit was a weapon of war. Now, the new U.S. economy in 1781 was in shambles. The United States depended on French loans, frankly on the French fleet, significantly on the French army, plus the sacrifices of the small continental army, which was always sort of near the borderline of extinction, just basically held together by the will of George Washington and a small group of people. Power without revenue is a bubble, wrote Hamilton. So it gave you a sense of his view, even as a soldier, actually courageously in the Battle of Yorktown sort of led the attack on one of the 2 British redoubts that led to the fall of Yorktown. But so when Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury 8 years later, he resolved to build a system of economics and financial power because he saw these as the foundation for the new nation's strength, its resilience, and its dynamism. Now, the cornerstone of his project, based on that experience of war, was to establish the U.S.'s financial credit. And he would ensure the confidence, if you will, of the new U.S. dollar, which, how would it work with sanctions today if people didn't feel the U.S. dollar was the most important currency? Now, some of you may recall, if you've read history, that his method required a combination of steps. He assumed the state as well as the federal debts. He restructured the loan payments from these loans that the United States owed the Dutch and the French and others. He founded a national bank. He created a sinking fund of reserves. But all these came together to try to create market and psychological confidence. It's very interesting. A lot of the historians that look at this kind of look at the steps, but they don't realize, as some of you who lived in markets know, the critical point was confidence. He was restoring confidence in the U.S. ability to frankly pay its debts and interest. But his design wasn't just financial. He wanted to use this confidence in his system for political, security, and economic ends. Remember, this is the man who also, frankly, tried to sort of build the U.S. Army and some ability, the first U.S. Navy. Now, none of this would work unless Hamilton could pay for the interest on the new bonds and for the new government itself. And what many people forget today was that in 1794, over 90% of the government revenues came from customs duties. And by the way, this continued even up through most of the Civil War. It's even quite high up to World War I. The United States wouldn't have been able to finance World War I until we instituted something called the income tax in 1916. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to pay for a lot of it. So Hamilton needed growing trade to finance a system, not only for the economic benefits of trade, but to provide the revenue. And that economic reality had very important foreign policy implications. So Hamilton, who's just finished fighting this long war with the British, decided to approach Britain about creating, in a sense, a community of interest. He believed that the United States could work within the British trading system and the British sort of global economy if Britain treated the United States with respect and also allowed the United States to grow. And he actually foresaw that the United States would become a power that could become a partner with Britain. In effect, what Hamilton was imagining was what historians later referred to as the special relationship, which took basically another century to move forward because the politics of the two countries were too sharp. Both the American public and the British public couldn't accept this idea. So the next best option for Hamilton was neutrality. In other words, if you're going to have trade to drive your revenue, you have to avoid Europe's wars. So now Britain and France are back at war, the French Revolution, Napoleonic War, and he wanted to keep the United States out of it to maintain the trade and the customs revenues. So this is why neutrality becomes the core theme of what historians refer to as George Washington's farewell address. It actually wasn't a speech. It was a piece that he wrote trying to, as he left the presidency, sort of guide his successors. And fundamentally, this idea of neutrality guides U.S. foreign policy for over a century. When Woodrow Wilson finally enters World War I in 1917, he does so as an associated power, not an allied power, because of so sensitivity of the notion of American alliances. But history, which as you can tell, I enjoy, is full of wonderful ironies. And so Thomas Jefferson, as you may recall, really distrusted the financial system. He was an agriculturalist. He didn't like bankers. He certainly didn't like Hamilton. But when Jefferson decides to buy Louisiana in 1803 for $15 million, he could only do so because of the strong credit of the U.S. bonds that had been used to pay Napoleon. So remember, you buy something for $15 million. The United States didn't have $15 million of spare change. It didn't have $15 million of gold. It had bonds. And it was Hamilton's bonds that allowed Jefferson to buy Louisiana, perhaps his greatest success. Now, for my second story, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. Now we're going to jump to 1930. So the Great Depression was just beginning under President Herbert Hoover. And Congress, in its wisdom, thought it could isolate the U.S. economy from the rest of the world by raising tariffs. So those are the taxes on trade. So there was a bill called the Smoot-Hawley Bill, later became the Tariff Act of 1930. And Congress was quite busy in this bill. It raised individual tariffs on over 3,300 items. The average tariff rate was 59.1%. And the congressional record is full of arguments that we hear echoed today. Unfair trade, we have to protect American producers, defend U.S. workers from foreigners. You can find all these in the congressional record of 1930. You can also find 20 pages of debate in the congressional record on tomato tariffs. But very few paragraphs on what this will do internationally. This gives you a sense of the world economy at that time. But other countries retaliated. They closed their markets. The United States trade fell 40 to 70%, depending if you do volume or the currency value. For some people that think trade surpluses are very important, the United States had a trade surplus in the 1930s. It also had 25% unemployment. So a trade surplus wasn't the magic bullet. Only 4 years later, in 1934, Secretary of State Cordell Hull persuaded Franklin Roosevelt as president to urge Congress to pass something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. Now, in 1934, there was no U.S. trade representative. The Secretary of State was involved with negotiations, if there were any, and Hull had served in Congress for many years, first in the House and in the Senate, so very experienced. He was part of the Southern coalition he was from Tennessee, that FDR sort of brought in. He had his sort of congressional relationships. So he persuades Roosevelt, who's at a point of experimentation at this point, to try this idea. And I went back and looked for the bill that was passed. It was 3 pages long. So for those of you that study Congress, let me tell you, if you can find a bill that's 3 pages long today, good luck. But what was amazing was in those simple 3 pages led to a huge shift. So what this bill did is it shifted the idea that Congress would set individual tariffs, it had done for some 150 years, to giving the executive authority to negotiate agreements to cut tariffs. Now, these were not free trade agreements. It didn't totally free up trade, but it gave the authority to cut tariffs up to 50%. And they didn't have to return to Congress. He could just do the deals on his own terms. Interestingly, Franklin Roosevelt wanted permanent authority. So if you go back and you look at many of the institutions created in the New Deal, they were created in this period and they're permanent authorities, whether it's FDIC or some of the SEC or other institutions. But Congress said, no, 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 we're not going to make this permanent. We'll only give it to you for 3 years, and you have to seek renewal. And that meant that, frankly, administrations since that time have had to work with Congress to extend this negotiating authority. So for some of you that study trade, you may have heard of the Trade Promotion Authority, which we did with President Bush 43, Fast Track, which we did with President Bush 41. These were variations on this notion that actually Congress expanded the authority for the executive branch to negotiate more than tariffs, even eliminate tariffs, cover services, intellectual property, other items, but then Congress said you have to bring it back to us for what would be an up or down vote. And these have always been very difficult votes because traditionally you've got members of Congress that have their particular local interests where presidents usually are trying to focus on the national interest. So back in 1934, Hull had gotten his trade authority, but he had a rival, a man named George Peck. George Peck controlled the new Ex-Im Bank, which was a little bit like OPIC, but for the sort of the trade sort of promotion side. And George Peck's idea was to have managed trade. So he wanted basically state-to-state sort of barter arrangements. And I'm drawing a distinction here between agreements that lower barriers and set rules for the private sector versus having the state do the over negotiations. Now, some of you actually may, if you watch trade and economics, there's a little echo here. When the Trump administration did its China deal, it was basically a state purchase arrangement. It's a big purchasing deal. And by the way, it fell about 40% short. So it actually kind of strengthened the state authority in China for the idea of trying to have a managed trade arrangement. Well, Mr. Peck chose Germany for his first big deal. And Germany was a big economy. And it was partly in exchange of cotton for wine and other commodities. But unlike normal trade, the Germans didn't have to pay in hard currencies that they earned. It was a barter arrangement. And FDR even approved Peck's deal, but Hull pushed back. And he's probably one of the few political leaders I've ever discovered that actually pushed back successfully against President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Hull wrote FDR that his rival's deal would kill the new type of agreements that Hull wanted to proceed under the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. He was trying to do one with Brazil, which is another big cotton producer, as well as Texas. And he felt that if we start to do barter arrangements, well, the Brazilians would do barter arrangements, and you'd break up into a fragmented system. But he had one other very strong argument. He reminded Roosevelt that the Nazis in power in Germany were trying to save the cash of hard currency to buy munitions. And he pointed out that many parts of the American public weren't so fans of the Nazi regime. So he actually got FDR to reverse himself. Now, over the next 10 years, even during World War II, Hull negotiated 31 deals with 28 countries. Canada was probably the most important, still the biggest trading partner of the United States, and it lowered tariffs to basically the pre-Smoot-Hawley levels. But just as important, maybe even more important, each of these agreements shared some common principles. One was barriers can come in all different forms, quotas, restrictions, others, and the idea was try to translate every barrier into a tariff level. So then you can negotiate lowering tariffs, because otherwise you just won't be able to overcome the barriers. Second was the notion of most favored nation. And most favored nation principle was that if country X gives country Y a lower tariff for a good, then all the other countries that you've given MFN to get the same benefit. So you have to be careful. If you give it to one, you're giving it to all. But you can see the dynamic that and likewise, if one of those countries gives a lower tariff to another country, the United States gets the benefit. So it creates a dynamic about sort of trying to lower the tariff barriers. And these become, and the third point was non-discrimination. What non-discrimination means in the world of trade is that governments are free to have whatever policies that they want to have, but they can't have those policies just discriminate against the foreign partner that is part of this agreement. You can't just use it against the foreign partner. Now, these three principles became the building blocks of the post-World War trading system, which was called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, which later becomes the WTO. Now, there's one more chapter about Cordell Hull's trade story that may be of special interest to a Texas audience. Hull's principal disciple was a man named Will Clayton, who joined the State Department in 1944, just as Hull was leaving. Clayton was born in Tennessee, but he became one of the founders of modern Houston with Jesse Jones, because he built, frankly, the biggest world-class cotton brokerage firm. He mastered the whole value chain, from all aspects of the cotton business internationally. He did business in Europe, he did business in Asia. Importantly, for what's going to come, he develops a view of how the world economy works. He called it the division of labor, the different sort of roles people have. Time magazine put him on its cover in 1936 under the label of sort of King Cotton. So in 1947, after World War II, one of the things that Clayton did, and it's not been recognized by most historians, was he was one of the real architects of the Marshall Plan, which of course jump-started the European integration and economic recovery. And you can see the notes from Clayton as he's writing Truman and or Secretary of State Marshall. He's applying his experience that the way an economy has to work with division of labor had just broken down in Europe. And so how do you sort of recreate that and jumpstart it? But that same year, in 1947, President Truman sends Clayton to Geneva, Switzerland, to negotiate this new general agreement on tariffs and trade, trying to build on the principles that the United States had in all these trade agreements from Hull. Now, the negotiations started quite well. They accepted the principles of Hull's trade agreements. But then there were only 23 countries at this point being part of it. And they start to negotiate tariff cuts. But Clayton gets hit with a big fist from back home, which is Congress passes a 50% tariff for wool. Now, that was a particularly rough blow because Australia, a close ally during World War II, depended very heavily on wool exports to the United States in those days. And the Australians said, we're walking out. And Britain, as the lead Commonwealth country, said, well, if Australia goes, we have to go. And the Europeans were, at that time, looking primarily to the British market, so they say, if the British goes, this really isn't anything for us. So Clayton flies back to see President Truman. And Truman gives the Secretary of Agriculture and Clayton 15 minutes each to make their case. So the Agricultural Secretary scoffed at the trade negotiations. It's that international stuff. And he said, look, let me give you the basics, President Truman. You could lose 7 wool-producing states in the 1948 election. That's what's at stake here. So poor Clayton has to argue for the long-term U.S. interest in international economy, a chance to work for success in Geneva. So the next day, Truman tells Clayton that he would veto the wool tariff bill and even okayed a 25% cut in the wool tariff. And Clayton said it's the most courageous political action he's ever seen in his life. Now, the Australians grumbled, as we know in negotiations. They probably wanted a deeper cut in tariffs. But the negotiations continued. Eventually, out of that first GATT round, they cut tariffs over 4,500 items, covering about half of the world trade. Now, by the way, Rob and I have probably been in a few meetings like Clayton had with Truman, where somebody is saying, oh, you're going to lose this state, you're going to lose that state, you can't do this politically. And for those of you that don't remember all your history, I'll just remind you that President Truman won the 1948 election. My third story concerns President Bush 41 and the creation of NAFTA. You've heard a little bit about that today. Most historians, of course, have written about President Bush's leadership of the peaceful end of the Cold War in Europe and the coalition to free Kuwait. So I had a wonderful opportunity to visit the Bush Library with Warren. It's a wonderful set of exhibits. But President Bush, Secretary Baker, Secretary Mosbacher also recognized the need for an economic underpinning for this new era. Secretary Baker helped launch APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, which led to some of our free trade areas and sort of the discussions to link the United States with the growing economies of East Asia. And Ambassador Carla Hills, who we've got somewhere in the netherworld here tonight, the U.S. Trade Representative moved forward the Uruguay Round negotiations, which was, I think, the 8th version of this GATT negotiations, eventually creating the WTO, which the Clinton administration completed at the end. Now, when President Carlos Salinas of Mexico approached the United States about a possible free trade agreement, he had observed the free trade agreement the United States had negotiated with Canada in 1988, which was also a very close-run thing. And if you look historically, there had been a number of efforts to do this before that had not been succeeded because the Canadians were always worried the United States would swamp their economy. Too big, too powerful to their neighbor to the south. If you actually look at what's happened over time is that the Canadian economy has become more efficient because if it can compete with the United States, it can compete globally. And Canadians had trade agreements all around the world. But so the Bush administration at this time understood that the initiative had to come from Mexico, given the history of U.S.-Mexican relations. But the idea about NAFTA was about much more than a trade agreement. You could see in 1990, 91, 92 that the old one-party state of Mexico, which was guided by the PRI, I always love this name, it's basically the Institutional Permanent Revolutionary Party, which struck me as a little bit of an oxymoron, but nevertheless it worked for about 50 years coming out of the 1920s and 30s. But the old PRI in Mexico was what political scientists might call a corporatist state. And there were some similarities actually with Europe and Italy and Spain in the 20s and the 30s. And in a corporatist state, you had the president at the apex with a one-party system, but all institutions of society have to fit within that party hierarchy. Businesses, unions, Congress, governors, courts, media, universities, the army, all of them had this kind of fit within this sort of hierarchical structure. So as the old PRI system was starting to break down because of the problems of the debt crisis and some of the competition and frankly mismanagement of the oil resources in Mexico, we had to wonder, well, where will Mexico's institutions attach? Will they become controlled by oligarchs? Will they become controlled by narcotics networks, organized crimes? And Carolina is one of the people that dealt with this in Colombia, because it was one of the questions in Colombia was, could you have a narcotics society separate from the rest of civilian society? Because everybody knew it was extremely dangerous and difficult to deal with. And the Colombians eventually had the courage to recognize, no, you can't. You have to take on that issue, which of course is an extremely difficult sort of challenge to deal with. So this is the question of what would happen with Mexico in 1992. Of course, in 1990, 91, 92, Mexico was starting to be an emerging democracy. You started to have the PAN party in the north. You started to have sort of more competitive politics. So the idea for President Bush's administration was, could the economic links of trade and investment help open the Mexican system up? Yes, with trade and investment, but more broadly, so as to connect with U.S. and Canadian models and networks. And so, in a way, NAFTA was to try to also help Mexico import the economic rule of law. The investment provisions, the Mexican negotiators will tell you, this is the exact point. They wanted to basically to have higher standards so as to draw foreign investment, but also part of their own system. But the idea was, once we could open the situation up, could we extend that network beyond business, civil society, media, universities, students, NGOs, environmental groups, just as you have in other pluralistic democratic societies. But we also had another idea. We didn't want Mexico to be solely looking to the north and to the hegemon to the north. So we also wanted to help Mexico expand its global perspective. So we encouraged Mexico to join APEC with Asia Pacific, become a member of the OECD, which under Bush 43 administration appointed a Mexican as the head of the OECD. He just recently sort of stepped down. The Mexican central bank and finance ministries became truly world-class institutions. Augustine Carstens, who held both posts, was a couple years ago, was asked to be the head of the BIS, which is in a sense the central bank's central bank in Geneva. But one other important point for those days, you remember this was also when the European Union was starting to integrate. And we realized that the notion of integration in North America had to be different than it was in Europe. The European Union has a notion of shared sovereignty across the different states. Well, given the histories of Mexico, Canada, and the United States, all three countries have very strong sensitivities to their sovereignty and independence. Need I tell a group of Texans? And so we had to do this in a way that had the mutuality of the three countries while also respecting their independence. It's very interesting that, so over the 25 or 30 years that followed, the NAFTA idea accomplished much for Mexico on the economic side, but some of the other institutions, education and schools, unions, lagged, particularly, as you would know, in the public security area. Nevertheless, the ties that NAFTA helped build were strong enough that when more recent administrations, including President Trump, wanted to kill it, they couldn't do it. The ties were too deep. You missed, for those of you that again follow the business news, you just had a big debate about mergers of the Canadian National buying Kansas City Southern because of the rail connectivity all through that's happened with transport and infrastructure sort of networks. And so the USMCA, which is the rewrite of NAFTA, basically kept the core part of the agreement. It modernized some features. But for those of you that want to know the details of this, it had some harmful effects too. For example, it lessened the protections of investment. Now, why was that? Well, because frankly, the administration at that time said, we don't want to encourage foreign investment in Mexico. We want to keep it all here. Well, you have to ask yourself, if you don't have investment in Mexico, what's going to happen to Mexico and immigration for Mexico, a healthy society? Don't you want to have a win-win situation for the economy? So, and again, today, a lot of what you see going on in Mexico is whether President Lopez Obrador, in some ways, is trying to turn the clock back in Mexico. He's trying to go back to the old personalized institutional rule of Mexico that was part of the old PRI system. He also was no fan of NAFTA, but NAFTA was embedded into the economies, so he couldn't turn back that clock. But let me just suggest another vision for North America, and this one goes back to Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan launched his presidential campaign in 1979, he gave a speech in which he said, it's time to stop thinking about Mexico and Canada, our nearest neighbors, as foreigners. We actually be better off if they're growing and stronger. Now, imagine that. I mean, he's running for president. His first speech, he's talking about trying to bring North America closer together and treat Mexicans and Canadians as part of a partnership, recognizing citizenship and all the sensitivities of immigration. He had a vision about what North America could be like. It's amazing in the context of our political debate today, but Ronald Reagan often had some very strong visions like that ended up proving that he was correct. But so what about a North America of three democracies, about 500 million people, which by the way puts China in a different sort of category of size, energy self-sufficiency, even ability to export, infrastructure and border procedures so that we can take advantage of the agriculture, the manufacturing, the innovation of all three countries. Better demographics than China, the European Union, certainly Japan, if we recognize human resources as an asset and try to think about how you help with the skill levels of people. Supply and logistics chains that would compete with China. So if you want to talk about reshoring, why not be able to try to do it in a North American context? And building on that, cooperation on a series of transnational issues, whether air, water, environment, sort of shared bounty, illegal immigration, health, pandemic issues, and other security questions, including the future of Central America. So I'll share with you one other anecdote. When I first dealt with Mexican foreign policy in the 80s, and if I'd left my briefing book at home and I needed to know what the Mexican position was, I could think of the U.S. position and put a minus sign in front of it. Now, why was that? Well, frankly, one of the ways that the PRI system dealt with the dissatisfied intellectuals was they put them in the foreign ministry, and they could, read nice books, take travel, so on and so forth, and indulge in anti-Americanism. When I became trade representative in 2001, my two closest partners on global negotiations were Mexico and Canada. The system had sort of come around. Now, this is still a challenge today in the nature of Mexican politics, but Texans particularly would have a sense of this because this is a country that lost a third of its territory in the Mexican War to the United States. It's not surprising. There's a little wary about this. So the old phrase about poor Mexico, so far from God, some close to the United States. We almost went to war with Mexico again in 1916. Sensitivities run very, very deep. So the fact that you could transform some of these attitudes in the space of 20 or 30 years, that's what makes history. I'll give you another example. When I was at the World Bank, I was dealing with some issue, and I was speaking to Chancellor Merkel, and we were talking about bringing developing and developed countries together. I think it was actually on an environmental topic. And I said, well, we've got Mexico on our side. And she said, well, of course, you've got Mexico on your side. That wouldn't have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. But it shows kind of what the nature of an NAFTA transformation did in the relationship. Now, I also have a little Texas flavor to the NAFTA story, too. So in 1991, we've got Ambassador Hills here. USTR was pretty busy trying to finish the Uruguay Round negotiations. And it was a big chance of subsidies and market access and a new dispute settlement. And USTR is kind of a small office. But frankly, working with Secretary Baker at the State Department, we thought this is a historic opportunity for the reason that I mentioned, following through on Ronald Reagan's vision as well. And when I tried to push that issue, I knew I had a hand of aces because I had a Secretary of State, a Secretary of Commerce, and a president, all from Texas. And that gave me an advantage in playing the cards of politics. And Ambassador Carla Hills, to her credit, showed great skill in getting this negotiation done in a pretty short period of time and sort of really making the critical decisions that had to be done for a historic agreement. Now, let's step back to reflect on the implications of my stories for economic statecraft today. What we've seen is the importance of America's financial credit. Don't take that for advantage. The power of the US dollar, that's the world's currency. But we can also see the reach and influence of US trade and investment policies, of course connected to finance and investment, as OPIC did, especially if based on rules and standards and competition that creates mutual benefit for the partners. So, sometimes when you hear people talk about diplomatic negotiations, they kind of assume that you can just go in and tell the other party, I want you to do this or that and the other thing, and if they don't agree, we just speak more slowly and sort of louder until they agree. It kind of helps to be able to say there's win-win possibilities here for people. U.S. economic diplomacy has revealed the magnetic power of the United States' openness and our values as a society. People want to be part of this system, and especially if the U.S.-led system frees and empowers the private sectors. I want to keep coming back to this point. It's not just government to government. What makes this tricky is you're trying to create environments for the private sector to drive entrepreneurship and technology. I just mentioned in passing the Marshall Plan. Well, that represents another example of economic statecraft, to try to help partners help themselves, adding to global growth and opportunity. OPIC was another example of trying to do using this tool. And we can also recognize the power of American humanitarian assistance. For example, I think historians will note one of President Bush 43's great legacies was the creation of this PEPFAR program to try to deal with the scourge of HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa. Later he added malaria and tuberculosis. If you talk to Africans and even sort of look at some of the embassies, this is probably the best thing the United States has done for Africa in history. Sort of little known here. But by the way, when I was talking with some people in the Kerr administration, I would have advised them to use the PEPFAR model as one for COVID vaccines, because it wasn't just a question of making vaccines available, it's the distribution system that made that happen. Now, all these initiatives and others can be connected with international economic institutions. And so with skilled leadership, the United States can leverage institutions to build coalitions, mobilize more resources, sometimes mediate or resolve disputes, negotiate new rules and standards, because the world economy is constantly changing. So today in the trade area, probably the digital trade and data trade is more important than the sort of traditional trade topics. Now, I opened by referring to economic sanctions and recognizing as a penalizing tool for economic statecraft. And I said I'd return to that as I closed. So I expect that the use of sanctions are going to lead some politicians to call for what I describe as a fortress economy. But the idea is we don't want to be subject to somebody else's sanctions, so we need self-sufficiency, we need national controls of all our value chains. And if you ask me if this is real, ask yourself how many times in President Biden's recent State of the Union did he talk about Buy America restrictions, okay? We're supposed to buy everything here. Interestingly, if you're going to make limitations, why not at least make it buy North America? I mean, because there's things that, frankly, Mexico is going to produce that otherwise China would produce. So why not sort of strengthen our own continental base by doing that? You can see this move towards fortress economics in China, with Xi Jinping's return to a very old Chinese idea of self-strengthening movements through what he calls the dual circulation plan. You can see some discussions in Europe talking about economic autonomy. And look, these ideas are going to be very popular with groups that like protection, like subsidies, the national champions. Texans, I hope, recall that until recently you had a ban on oil exports, so we're supposed to keep all our oil at home. Of course, the oil market is a global market price, so what did that sort of accomplish other than to hurt the energy industry here? These ideas of fortress economics at first sound like, oh, well, this is going to be safe along the way. But that conclusion would be ironic and deeply wrong if you think about what actually happened with the U.S. sanctions, whether on financial institutions, the Russian central bank, technology-specific inputs. The success is dependent on U.S. leadership of a committed international coalition and partnership. The controls on the Russian central bank wouldn't have worked if the euro wasn't part of it, if the yen wasn't part of it, if the Swiss franc wasn't sort of part of it. So it was a question of trying to leverage U.S. leadership with coalition, with allies and partners. The dollar system, along with other reserves currencies, has been so influential that even some of the Chinese institutions are now being careful about what they do with Russia because they don't want to be cut off from the US dollar sort of clearing system. Of course, less economic connections are going to lead to lower productivity and growth, smaller markets and less competition, more government controls and opportunities for waste, subsidies, and corruption, and something that is on a lot of people's minds, it's going to raise prices. So if you're concerned about higher inflation, you ought to be concerned about adding barriers to trade. And at the end of the day, it lowers incomes. So the U.S. government and businesses need resilience and buffers and cushions within an international system to avoid the choke points and costs and crises. I serve on a number of company boards. I advise other companies, and you can see the change in terms of sort of how people are looking supply and logistics systems. You need more diverse sources. You need to make sure where your parts are coming from through it all. But the key is to try to do these insurance policies within a healthy international network. And from my point of view, it's best if the United States economy is at the nucleus of that network to have sort of most influence going forward. So I don't believe we're ever going to achieve economic security by retreat. I don't think that's going to be a winning strategy over time. So you need to be on offense, trying to shape the international economic landscape. As my stories have showed, we've done over the course of 200 years. I've always believed that America's ace in the hole has been its openness to goods, to investment and capital, to people and ideas. Of course, you have to regulate this. I understand with the sort of immigration issue. Though, yeah, I tell you, you look at a lot of the entrepreneurial developers in, Silicon Valley or other parts of this economy, and they're often immigrants or children of immigrants. So you need to have a legal immigration system that draws the talent from the world. And I think there's a simple logic behind this, which is, look, we like to think we're always making the right decisions, whether individually, our company, or our country. But guess what? People make mistakes. They make missteps. But one thing that is the case is that open systems allow you to identify the problems earlier. What's part of the problems of Russia's problem is you could see Putin didn't even have the information about what the real nature of things in Ukraine. And it's going to be a problem in China as well. So open systems force you to face, well, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe there's a different view, and it allows you to sort of adjust the system. So I think the United States economic diplomacy should capitalize on our national strengths, expand our economic power. And so let me just close by thanking you again for the invitation to be with you. I believe this is going to be one of those important moments again in the United States. So I think that the Bush Foundation and school, the library, the Mosbacher Institute, and frankly, supported by all of you, are going to be very important in shaping this debate, shaping the next generation. I met some fantastic young students, including some from different parts of the world that now have a little idea of where Texas A&M is and the nature of the community that all of you have created here, it's the best advertisement the United States can ever make. And again, you know, I visited lots of countries all over the world. And, you know, when you, not everybody, but by far, the people that had a chance to study here, work here, they come away with a better sense. You know, otherwise America looks a little big and scary to them, but they sort of see the opportunity here. So that's a great contribution your university is making. And the reason this is so important is the other part of this from a national perspective is you got to work with other countries. You got to have others sort of be your partners. But we're still in a world where only American leadership can make this work, whether it's security alliances, whether it's economic arrangements, whether it's humanitarian support, and we need to do so. So I want to thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all that you're doing for these important institutions.
Well, there's a couple things I'd like to start off with after that amazing speech and remarks. I mean, I want to thank you so much for your visit here today. Ambassador Zoellick has been with students and in classes, and it's been a remarkable smashing success. I mean, the students are raving about it, so we want to make sure smashing success. And we wanted to, definitely thank you for that. And I wanted to thank everyone here for attending tonight. I mean, this is such an important event. And I think we're going to highlight on some of the real weight of this and why this might actually be a turning point, we hope, in the American trajectory. But a couple things I do want to say is, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, America and the World, I would highly recommend it. It's not just a book about the history of diplomacy in the United States, but it's about stories about people, and it's got heroes and villains, and it's got intrigue, and it's actually really an amazing example of successful storytelling in a way that I think is really captivating. The second thing...
Wait. And it's on Amazon, and you can get it in paperback if you don't want to pay the full price.
That's right. The second thing I really like about it, though, is that it really reflects the American tradition of pride and American exceptionalism, the pride and the greatness and the ideals of this country, which I think sometimes we miss in some of the furor in the news and the media. And so I wanted to thank you so much for reflecting that and actually bringing back that reminder of the pride that we have in our amazing country. I realize that we don't have a super lot of time, and I want to make sure we can capture some questions from the audience. I think the ambassadors handed out a little slip, so if you wanted to submit your questions electronically, that's why I have my phone. I'm not checking my email when I'm looking at my phone. You know what I mean? I'm looking
Stock
for your
market's
questions.
closed.
So, yeah, exactly. I have my stocks. But one of the first things I did want to really focus on is that you talk about, throughout the book, the importance of trade and the leadership of America in trade. But as you've noticed, over the last decade, the international enthusiasm for trade has been waning, right? And one of the things I loved about, you mentioned Cordell Hull, was he had this vision for free trade, but it took him a long time to actually realize that vision because there's so much resistance. How do you feel that we, as Americans, as Texans, and as the Mosbacher Institute, can recapture the free trade momentum that has served America so well?
Well, one thing I didn't have a chance to mention, Raymond, is you have to help people adjust. And whether it's trade or technology, and you've got a lot of business people in this audience, a company or a sector that stays still is going to get overwhelmed, right? And you've seen the disruptive technologies in particular. And that frightens people. And so I actually, going back to Bush 41, for my various sins in the Bush administration, I went over with Baker as the Deputy Chief of Staff in August of 1992. The timing was a little rough, as you can imagine, for the re-election campaign. And I actually one of the first things I had to do was come up with an economic plan for President Bush. And it's one of the things I have to talk about with Warren. I might have the only copy of it left, but anyway, sort of to give to the library. But I included the notion of President Bush's international skill with diplomacy, but linking it to the idea of trade agreements and free trade. But I also included the idea of how we're going to have to help people adapt, including with the notion that if your healthcare or your educational things are all linked to kind of your job and you're going to have dislocations, you have to help people adapt. That's one sort of key point. The second point is, and this is where I've sort of been a bit of an activist on this topic, is that if you look at the polling numbers, like I was telling you, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does these annual surveys. American support, is globalization a good thing? It's like in the 70s to 80s, okay? If you ask about, is trade a good thing? Yes. You know, even is it good for American workers? It's like 65% or something like that. Now, people know, you know, when you talk about particulars, then they can get worried. But if you think also for younger people that live in a connected world, do they know that, you know, do people in Texas know that Latin America is important, Mexico is important? Of course they do. And so the question is, how do you kind of take that and realize that there's going to be shrill voices that become interests that try to have protection, going back to their stories with Alexander Hamilton or Cordell Hull or George Peck or others? They're always going to be out there. You have to fight them. Sorry, you have to do it. I remember we were saying, you know, President Obama, you know, who was not hostile to trade, but he basically, he told his staff, he said, I don't want you mentioning the word NAFTA. Well, how are you going to win a debate if only one side gets to talk? Right? So part of it is standing up for these types of things. But then you also have to deal pragmatically with politics. So Congressman Kevin Brady, who's from Houston, who's the leading ranking Republican on Ways and Means. Sad to say he's stepping down. He helped me with CAFTA and trade issues, a real devoted trade person. I actually met with him and with the Republican who's going to be, assuming the Republicans take the House, chairing the trade subcommittee. And we're trying to say, okay, how can you build on things? So, you know, one possibility was this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was negotiated with 11 other economies. The U.S. drops out. You know, it's become sort of political green kryptonite for some people in Congress. But if they're worried about China, maybe they need to take a look at that. Can they recast it as a way of dealing with China? Because frankly, we're out of the game in East Asian economy. And so the Chinese have the advantage of geography. They have the advantage of economic gravity, as a trade person would say it. And frankly, if you talk to people in Asia, they kind of say, we want the United States here. You're providing us the 7th Fleet. You got a military. Don't you want to be part of the economic arrangement? Or another possibility would be a digital accord, as I sort of alluded to. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a month or two ago where I tried to explain this isn't just for the technology industry. And I went through agriculture, I went through machinery. Everything depends on data and digital connectivity. And frankly, it's just been accelerated by the pandemic. So maybe you could do a digital accord with things. What about if the USMCA, which in my view is a mixed blessing, but it brought together some Republicans and Democrats, why not take that and say, why not do something with Great Britain, which has left the European Union? If a key part of Democratic support was the labor standards and labor provisions, don't you think that British labor standards probably are, you know, an acceptable level? Could we do that as a political basis? And then there's the other details, like for example, we talked about USMCA. The implementation is going to be very important. So for example, there are standards to help deal with labor unions in Mexico. And this one could go either way. If I talked about the development of institutions in Mexico from the old system, if it helps make cleaner, more transparent, good unions in Mexico, okay. If it's used as a device to basically block Mexican, say, oh, they're not up to our standards, we're not going to trade with them, then it's not going to be good. So it's, what I'm suggesting is you kind of, this is where political pragmatism has to come in and sort of figure out the effort. But at the end of the day, and this is, you know, we're here at the Bush 41 sort of foundation and institute, you know, Bush 41 had the courage to fight these types of things. It wasn't always popular to sort of get them done, you know, but would you rather have a place in history of making a mark or just kind of figure out sort of how to hide from tough issues?
I'm really glad that you brought up this idea of pragmatism, because that's a theme that runs throughout the entire book, and you demonstrate sort of character after character who's illustrating pragmatism, including George H.W. Bush. That's important for us, I think, to all to keep in mind. But on that note, one of the questions that did come in from the audience and that I'm very curious about is that you mentioned this focus of integrating not just the United States, Mexico, and Canada, but you mentioned the potential for Central America. But that's also been mentioned in your book from the time of Monroe, right? Integrating the Americas more broadly, and yet it continues to be very difficult. Do you have a sense of where that difficulty is coming from, and what might we be able to do pragmatically to overcome some of those difficulties?
Well, you've got the trade policies in the United States that are not trade friendly, and it also depends on the nature of the governments. Carolina was part of a government that frankly took Colombia in the direction of free trade, and if you look at the history of Colombian industrialization, it used to be more protectionist, but President Uribe took a courageous sort of course on that, as in other things. So here's the idea that I would plant in your mind. If you look at this Trans-Pacific Partnership, the United States negotiated with 11 other countries, 6 of which already had U.S. free trade agreements. And that wasn't accidental. So basically, it was the architecture, the provisions, the rules, the standards came from U.S. free trade agreements. So you added Japan and Malaysia and others. So it's a sad thing we pulled out of it. But take Latin America. I mean, when I came in with President Bush 43 in 2001, there was a discussion about the free trade area of the Americas. And it was a nice vision. Clinton administration would often have bold, great ideas, okay? But frankly, I always knew it was going to be darn hard. You got Venezuela, you got Argentina, Brazil, it's not going to be easy, right? And so look at what we did. You had NAFTA. We added the 5 countries of Central America and the Dominican Republic. We added Panama. We added Colombia. We added Peru. We added Chile. And so you started to create a rather big potential peace. And one of the other ideas I later wrote was to say, look, as a start, why not create a hub? I'm sorry, I suggested Miami, where we could actually connect some of our development policies, just like Rob did with OPIC, to our sort of trade policies, but also universities, people, young, come in through in areas. And maybe someday you could integrate those into one trade agreement. Brazil will be the big one. And so Brazil tends to be protectionist, but at times there's Brazilian governments that have said, well, maybe we need to open up more, and that would be a good thing to connect it with. But the beautiful idea about these systems is they go beyond the United States. So frankly, there was something called the Pacific Alliance, where Carolina may have been involved with this. It was Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia. That was basically promoting the types of things the United States wanted to promote, and it wasn't accidental, they're all U.S. free trade partners, right? But it all comes down ultimately to the politics. I mean, you look at what's happened in the Peruvian elections. Colombia faced a challenging election. Chile, who knows what the nature of the governments are going to be. But one thing is important is what I've tried to do with economics, and what I tried to do tonight is, I know that lots of people will think, how can we use our economic power to hit somebody, like sanctions? What I'm trying to suggest is, think about how you can develop systems that become attractive power, that draw people to you along the way. And particularly with Latin America, where there's a lot of sensitivities about, the gringos to the north here, you gotta have a sense of, how can you make this appealing to people? How do you feel that it helps their development? Now, but again, just to give you a little further example, Costa Rica was part of CAFTA. Obviously, it was the better off country among the Central Americans. But it had, from the 20s and 30s, kind of a state-owned telecommunications and insurance company. And I didn't care so much for U.S. economic interest. I wanted to open it up for the sake of Costa Rican reform, including the fact that if you had an old telecommunications system, it wasn't going to be cost effective, it wouldn't modernize, so on and so forth. So we just put some provisions in there just to kind of nudge. Well, eventually the Costa Rican system did get changed, and so one of my friends at IBM was on all the information centers that they had, the call centers and all this, and for Spanish speakers in Costa Rica. It gives you an example of how you can leverage these things over time. And certainly it's in our long-term interest that Latin America be healthy, economic, and growing, and buy from the U.S. too. And particularly, one of the things on the protectionism, this is a school of agriculture as well, right? Well, guess what, guys? 1 out of 3 acres that America plants get exported. So you want to have national economic systems? Well, then you're going to have a lot of American agricultural products just sitting at home, because everybody will say, we're going to have our own agriculture in our country. And it's true with a lot of what the American service industries, this is, sort of ag and technology, sort of a development. And so, you know, there's also, this is, by the way, you also think about the politics. So given the Senate, with 2 senators per state and a lot of farm states, you can build farm and agricultural support for your trade liberalization agenda.
So one last question, because I realize we're already running a little bit over time. I could spend all night, obviously, chatting, but a lot of people are worried about Ukraine and thinking about the Russian conflict. And in particular on the theme of economics and economic diplomacy, there was a lot of belief prior to this invasion that countries with a McDonald's, as Tom and Friedman, I think, referred to at one point, just would never attack each other. And yet in your book, you say that people like Cordell Hull, right, sort of underestimated the goals of the fascists. What do you see sort of as the lessons coming out of our diplomacy with Russia in particular? And has this really strengthened the return to a focus on U.S. alliance building?
So, interesting set of questions. And just to deal with the point that you began with, look, as I've said tonight, I believe that, you know, economics can become an important part of your diplomacy. It's not the only part of your diplomacy. And so, you know, there was a book that's famous before World War I written by Norman Angell called The Grand Illusion. He later wins the Nobel Peace Prize. And his argument was, it was actually a little bit more sophisticated than the critics have said. He said, you know, the European economies are so integrated that war will be costly and foolish. And so people have interpreted it as saying war could never happen. And I think the book was published in 1910 or 11, 1914, you have World War I and a cataclysm, okay? But in reality, what he was saying was not wrong. What he was saying is, if you go to war, you're going to, you know, it's going to be devastating. And it was. I mean, it really ended the European leadership in the global system and helped lead to World War II. So you need to think about deterrence, defense, you know, you'll have human rights as part of your policies. It's kind of the mix, which are some of the things that I also sort of talk about in the course of the book. I'll share with you, however, one other little anecdote about Ukraine that I haven't mentioned to people before, which is that when I was president of the World Bank, I could see that Ukraine was going to be a pivotal country in the relationship of Russia and Europe and North America. And as some of you may know, it was a democracy, unlike what Russia became, but it struggled a lot with corruption and economic reforms. And so I remember going to the then Prime Minister Tymoshenko, who was a woman with the blonde pigtails, if you recall. And she was a tough person. She'd probably made a lot of money through the energy industry, a little bit on the questionable side. But she also knew how to get things done in the Ukrainian system. So I said, look, let me try to develop some projects with you to help Ukraine, but I need you to do some reforms. And if I offer these to you, can you get them through the Rada, the legislature, to sort of help make the reform process? And we started that, and I actually had the feeling that the best solution for Ukraine was to have a healthy relationship with Europe and with Russia. I didn't want it to become an either-or. And ironically, I approached the Russian finance minister, a man named Kudrin, who knew Putin before. He's one of the good economic technocrats. And I said, look, if we try to help with Europe and the World Bank and the U.S., could Russia come in to help develop this? And Kudrin's response at that time was, Ukraine's a black hole. Why should I put money into that place? Okay, so there was a different view than Putin. I went to Merkel, the German chancellor, and said, look, this is going to be important for Germany. And she said, oh, go talk to Obama. So I couldn't move it forward. But the point of this was, there is something about trying to anticipate these things. You know, could there have been a different path of reform with Ukraine where it developed a different relationship? And that takes you to the present story. So to get a feel for what's happening now and going to happen, it's very important to understand how one person, Putin, looks at Ukraine. And he sees it through his lens of Russian history, which he thinks Ukraine is not an independent country. You know, the Rus came out of Kiev in the Middle Ages. He thinks this is part of Greater Russia. He's written scathing things about Lenin because Lenin helped establish it as an independent republic even within the Soviet Union. And he told a senior U.S. official that saw him a few months ago, as he was starting to mobilize efforts, he says, "What choice do I have?" Now, that's a strange comment, but what it meant was he felt Ukraine was moving to the West. He's 69 years old. He sees this not only as a question of Russian history, but his place in Russian history. And frankly, he probably had bad intelligence about what the Ukrainian people would support. And so this is not a question of I want resources alone or want this or that. This is a question of somebody who's going to double down on this. And so I think what we need to expect, as you see their initial sort of military actions were poorly calculated. They kind of went on three fronts. They expected a collapse of the Ukrainian system, but they're now going to mobilize in the east and the south. They're going to try to control that Black Sea sort of points. They're going to try to squish Ukraine back to kind of, a small point. They wanted to take it over, but they didn't even have the troops to be able to do that. And so it's very important that, frankly, the West give the military supplies for the Ukrainians to be able to fight. We're not going to fight for them, but we need to help them be able to fight for themselves. But coming back to your question, there should be an economic component. I mean, not only a humanitarian aspect, but people are starting to write, look, maybe, we need to take, at some point there'll have to be a Ukrainian reconstruction, not just buildings and infrastructure, but some of these political issues that were not dealt with so well, and reform and other aspects. Could, to be honest, the World Bank and IMF are having their spring meetings in a week or two. I wrote the head of the IMF, who was a colleague of mine. I said, look, it's a good time to push some of these ideas. Get the IMF, get the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank, try to put something together here, not only for the economics, but think of the signal to the Ukrainian people, saying, look, we're with you. You're fighting a courageous battle for all of us, but we'll be there with you. But also in a process that kind of builds future reforms. So it's a good example of kind of thinking about the economic with the political security side. One last point, however, I mean, not to be a downer, but in diplomacy, you have to think of what could happen with escalation. So, if Putin is thwarted for the reasons I said, maybe he says, okay, I just want to control the East or something. Maybe there's some negotiated settlement there. Would not be easy for Zelensky, because he said he'd have to bring it to the Ukrainian people. But maybe there is something there. And by the way, if Zelensky wants to do it, that may be the way, again, you have to offer some support for him so he can sort of try to do it. An alternative is it becomes like North and South Korea. It just becomes, an armistice in a war zone. And another alternative is that, Putin decides to up the ante. What if he uses chemical weapons? What if he uses tactical nuclear weapons? And so, you also have a corps of cadets here. When you unleash wars, and the wolves of dogs of war are unleashed, you have to prepare for the unexpected. And I mention this because, look, President Bush and Secretary Baker were masters of this. You talk about pragmatists. The invasion of Kuwait was not something that we expected. I mean, you kind of saw that sort of in days before. But their ability to pull together a global coalition, I mean, Baker even went around the world, and collected money for others to pay for the thing, is that that ability and pragmatism and skill, but also adaptability, is critical in your diplomacy. So we'll see how that plays out.
I'm not sure we're going to sleep better tonight after that, but I will hope you'll join me in thanking Ambassador Zoellick. Thank you very much for your comments. We really thank you all for joining us tonight. We really hope you'll continue to stay engaged with our Mosbacher Institute and these exciting events that we're bringing here to College Station. So thank you all very much, and hope you have a pleasant evening.